Venezuela holds more proven oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than any country on earth. Right now, the man who ran that country for 12 years is sitting in a federal jail cell in Brooklyn waiting for trial. His name is Nicolás Maduro. He got there because a foreign army broke into his palace, flew him to a warship, then to Cuba, then to upstate New York in about a day. That story starts almost a century before he was born, in a swamp on Lake Maracaibo. Before 1920, Venezuela was a poor farming country that lived on coffee and cacao exports, like its neighbors. Oil changed that faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Within a single decade, petroleum went from 2.5% of the economy to 40%. On December 14, 1922, a well called Barroso No. 2 blew out near the town of Cabimas. It sprayed crude into the sky for 9 straight days before anyone could cap it, and it made Venezuela an oil nation almost overnight. The oil boom happened under a dictator. Juan Vicente Gómez ruled Venezuela for 27 years, from 1908 to 1935, and it was his government that handed out the concessions to Shell and Standard Oil that built the fields around Lake Maracaibo. Venezuela's oil wealth and Venezuela's authoritarianism arrived together from the start. 38 years later, Venezuela's oil minister, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, flew to Baghdad and helped found a cartel of oil-producing states to control the price of crude together instead of undercutting each other. He called it OPEC. Venezuela was a founding member, alongside Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. It paid off fast. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo quadrupled world oil prices, and it added roughly $10 billion to Venezuela's treasury in 2 years. Venezuela had the highest income per person anywhere in Latin America. People nicknamed the country Venezuela Saudita, Saudi Venezuela. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the whole industry into one state company, Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, but let it keep running like a real business, with career engineers and contracts with foreign oil firms. That arrangement is what made the machine actually work. None of it survived the 1980s. Oil prices crashed, and on February 18, 1983, a day Venezuelans still call Black Friday, the government devalued the currency for the first time in decades. The boom was over. 6 years later, the government struck a new deal with the IMF. In February 1989, gas prices jumped overnight and bus fares rose 30%. Riots broke out in the hillside slums of Caracas, soldiers were sent in with live ammunition, and official counts say more than 300 people were killed in a week. Watching soldiers fire on civilians radicalized a young paratroop officer named Hugo Chávez. 3 years later, on February 4, 1992, he led a coup attempt of his own. It failed within hours. Put on television to call off his remaining troops, Chávez said 2 words that made him a national figure: por ahora, for now. By the 1990s, Venezuelans had grown exhausted with the same 2 parties trading power since 1958, under a pact meant to prevent dictatorship that had curdled into protecting the establishment instead. Chávez ran against all of it. He spent 2 years in prison for the coup. When he got out, he didn't pick up a weapon again. In 1998, he ran for president instead, and won with 56% of the vote, promising to take Venezuela's oil back for the people the boom had left behind. Chávez's opponents didn't accept that quietly. In April 2002, business leaders and dissident generals forced him from office. It lasted 47 hours before soldiers loyal to Chávez put him back in the palace. The trigger was oil. Chávez had installed loyalists atop PDVSA, and the company's own veteran staff walked out in protest, shutting the industry down for 2 months. It cost the state $14 billion in lost revenue and nearly $10 billion in tax and royalty payments the Treasury never collected. When the strike ended in early 2003, Chávez fired the strikers, around 18,000 of PDVSA's own engineers, geologists, and managers, and replaced them with people who had backed him. The company that had made Venezuela rich was now also a loyalty test. One of the men Chávez trusted through that purge was a former Caracas bus driver turned union organizer, Nicolás Maduro. He had no engineering background and none of Chávez's charisma, but his loyalty to the party carried him from the National Assembly to the Foreign Ministry to the vice presidency within a decade. The oil money that stayed under Chávez's control went straight into politics. Billions of PDVSA's dollars funded free clinics, subsidized food, and literacy programs called the Misiones, popular, oil-funded, and run outside the normal state budget where almost no one could audit them. And on paper, Venezuela's oil kept growing anyway. Government geologists reclassified the heavy, tar-like crude under the Orinoco River Basin as proven reserves, and within a few years the country's total passed 300 billion barrels, officially overtaking Saudi Arabia for the largest reserves on the planet. Actual output told a different story. In the late 1990s, Venezuela pumped more than 3 million barrels of oil a day. Under Chavez and the man he chose to follow him, that number would eventually fall by more than half. In December 2012, before flying back to Cuba for what would be his last cancer surgery, Chavez went on television and named the man he wanted to succeed him, Nicolás Maduro. Chavez never returned to public life. He died in a Caracas military hospital on March 5, 2013, and Maduro, his chosen heir, inherited the presidency and the machine that ran it. Maduro won the following election by a little more than 1 percentage point. He would never again win one that outside observers called free and fair. Oil prices crashed again in 2014, and by then there was no one left inside PDVSA with the experience to manage the shock. In 2016, Venezuela was still pumping 2.5 million barrels a day. 4 years later, under sanctions and mismanagement, that had fallen below 500,000. By last November, Venezuela, the country with the largest oil reserves ever measured, was producing under 1 million barrels a day. Less than 1% of what the world uses. Shortages got specific. As early as 2013, Venezuelans were tracking supermarket toilet paper deliveries like news bulletins. In the country holding more oil than any nation on earth, you sometimes could not buy a roll of toilet paper. By 2018, annual inflation had passed 80,000%. Since Maduro took office in 2013, the bolivar has lost more than 99.99% of its value, a currency broken that badly stops working as money. Between 2013 and 2020, Venezuela's economy shrank by roughly 88%. The U.S. Great Depression, by comparison, cost 29% of GDP and lasted 3 years less. Millions left the country. Doctors and engineers went first. Entire families walked out across the border into Colombia and Brazil, carrying whatever they could carry. By the time anyone counted, the United Nations put the number of Venezuelans who had fled at 7.7 million people, close to a quarter of the population, gone. Maduro held on anyway. He won re-election in 2018 in a vote most outside observers called neither free nor fair. In January 2019, the head of the opposition-controlled legislature, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president instead, backed by Washington and dozens of other governments. It didn't work. Maduro kept the loyalty of the military and the courts, and Guaidó's presidency existed mostly on paper and in foreign capitals. A second attempt to remove Maduro without force had failed. Cut off from its biggest oil customer by U.S. sanctions, Venezuela leaned on new buyers. China lent Caracas tens of billions of dollars over the years, repaid in oil shipments, and became what analysts started calling Venezuela's buyer of last resort. So Washington changed its approach. If elections and sanctions couldn't remove Maduro, a courtroom and eventually an army might. In 2020, the U.S. Justice Department indicted Maduro on narco-terrorism charges, accusing him of running a drug trafficking operation called the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, to the Venezuelan military itself. The reward for his capture started at $15 million. 14 other current and former Venezuelan officials were charged alongside him, including Diosdado Cabello, one of the most powerful men in Chavez and Maduro's government for over 2 decades. It climbed from there to $25 million under the next administration, $50 million by 2025, and then, from the State Department, as much as $100 million for the arrest of one sitting head of state. One more election came before the raid. In July 2024, Venezuelans voted, and by the opposition's own count, printed tallies from voting machines that they published themselves. Challenger Edmundo González won by a landslide. Maduro's electoral council declared him the winner anyway, without ever releasing the detailed results. The opposition's actual leader, Marisa Corina Machado, had already been barred from running. Afterward, the government accused her of terrorism, and she went into hiding. Maduro refused to leave office. A year later, in October 2025, the Nobel Committee gave Machado the Peace Prize for that fight. She accepted it still in hiding, still unable to walk freely in her own country. Maduro's refusal is what finally brought the reward, the indictment, and the United States military into the same room. Through the second half of 2025, the collision built in plain sight. U.S. warships, a nuclear submarine, and stealth fighters massed in the Caribbean, the largest American military buildup in the region in decades, while strikes on suspected drug boats killed more than 100 people offshore. Venezuela's own military held exercises in response. On January 2, 2026, American planners activated the mission they had spent half a year preparing, Operation Absolute Resolve. It launched at 10,046 that night. More than 150 aircraft moved across the Western Hemisphere in coordination, with cyber and air teams working first to blind Venezuela's air defenses so helicopters could get in low and undetected. At just after 2 a.m., Caracas time, Delta Force operators flown in by the Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, reached Miraflores Palace and went in for Maduro. Venezuelan officials said much of his security detail was killed in the raid. Trump said there were no American casualties. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were in U.S. custody within the hour. By 3029 that morning, Eastern Time, the assault force was already gone. The route from there moved fast. The amphibious warship USS Iwo Jima, then Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, then Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York, all inside a single day. 2 days later, Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in as interim president in front of the National Assembly. Trump announced the United States would, in his words, run the country until we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. On January 5th, Maduro stood before 92-year-old federal judge Alvin Hellerstein in a Manhattan courtroom. "I am the president of Venezuela," he said, "and I consider myself a prisoner of war. They captured me in my house in Caracas." The judge cut him off. When Maduro called himself kidnapped, Hellerstein told him this wasn't the time or place to argue his capture. Maduro answered anyway, "I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man." Celia Flores faced 3 charges of her own: cocaine importation conspiracy, and 2 counts of possessing machine guns and destructive devices. Both she and Maduro pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors allege something stranger than ordinary trafficking, that some of the cocaine Maduro's network sold had already been seized once by Venezuelan police, then quietly sold right back onto the market by the government that confiscated it. Then Trump turned to the oil itself. American companies would go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, he said, and start making money for the countries out of the same reserves Conves had seized from foreign companies 2 decades earlier. A week after the raid, Trump called off what he described as a planned second wave of strikes, though U.S. warships stayed in the Caribbean for safety and security. Within weeks, American forces hit another boat off the coast, the first strike since Maduro's capture. As of this recording, Maduro is still in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, waiting on a trial that could still be a year away. Delcy Rodriguez is still interim president. The oil, all 300 billion barrels of it, is still exactly where it was in 1922. Whoever ends up controlling that oil will help decide what you pay at the pump for years to come. Venezuela never stopped being the richest oil nation on earth. It just stopped being able to say who that made rich. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.